Welcome to the Monsters and Myths show, where we shine a light on the biggest barriers and obstacles that get in the way of getting things done. Today's guest is Samantha Emery, who is an innovation and transformation leader. Which to me immediately says, Sam, you have encountered a plethora of monsters and myths in your career, in your life, on your journey. Please, would you give the audience a little bit of context as to why it is that you may have encountered monsters and myths before we dive into your first one? And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So why have I encountered all of these monsters and myths? It's a good question, but with a pretty easy answer when you hear what I've got to say over the next couple of minutes. So whilst the very, very first parts of my career in financial services were in what were considered group functions, the early to mid part of my career was in the global transaction services division of a major bank, leading technical delivery, change management, transformation activities of what were at the time best in class online banking capabilities to customers, looking at product developments, looking at organizational redesign through the post-financial crisis landscape. And then I stepped out of industry into the regulatory space for a few years, and I worked at the UK's conduct regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, where I did a couple of things. I led activity in the payment supervision space for firms such as the emerging wave of e-money institutions that we saw appear post PSD2, who were building out and scaling their businesses, along with other non-bank payment services providers like the more established acquirers and remitters that we've known for decades. And I then spent time heading up their innovation unit. So as well as looking at innovation policy activities, I oversaw the enablement services. So things like the regulatory sandbox, which naturally saw a lot of take up from both startups, but also more established players who wanted to try something new and wanted to understand how it connected in with the regulatory perimeter. And that was a huge privilege. You're serving customers, businesses, industry with a very, very clear purpose. But you also have this unbeatable vantage point on the industry dynamics as a whole. So really, really sort of rich takeaways from that time. And much of both of those sort of first parts of my career were about leading change across diverse stakeholders, bridging the gap between the established and the new. And most of my roles have tended to be horizontal, be they sort of pan group within one organization, pan industry, or both. And the or both is sort of very much exemplified by my current role. So in Lloyds Banking Group, I lead the charge on payment strategy, both internally, but also the external strategy side of things, the payments industry evolution and that conversation. And so much of this ends up being about the most effective way of serving up payments technology as an enabler to deliver better for the UK's customers, its businesses, both domestically and internationally, which is central to Lloyds Banking Group's purpose of helping Britain prosper. And as well as these more strategic elements, I lead the digital payment schemes like faster payments, like CHAPS. I run the group's payment settlement and liquidity for the UK and the EU, deliver strategic design services, and ensure the group stays compliant with its own payments policy. So a very broad church of accountabilities, but that's what makes it exciting. There is literally no such thing as an average day, and I always make sure that I don't complain about that because it really is a blessing. But what it does demand of you is a real need to be able to balance the internal with the external that finds a way to take both forward, which I particularly enjoy. So coming back to your question of how have I hit all of these myths, monsters, and thereof, any role that is horizontal in any way, shape, or form requires that alignment, that coordination, the ability to manage outcomes across multiple strands of activity, manage demands across very, very diverse stakeholder groups, and in and amongst all of the daily treacle, still have that line of sight on the horizon as to where are you ultimately trying to get to and why.
Just the breadth of what you've been doing, it it's immediately conjuring up all sorts of barriers and obstacles that you would have encountered. Change is hard, and often changing people and attitudes, behaviors, biases, beliefs. Those are the monsters that you have to conquer very often. And I'm very eager to hear because you are very good at what you do, and you have been very successful. So, therefore, I'm hoping that you've got a bit of the magic that you use to overcome these barriers and obstacles that you'll be able to share with us. So, on that note, what's your top monster or myth that you can share with us?
Yes, so I have three, I will say, but the top one actually taps into exactly the point you've made. There is a technical element to all of this. You know, change and transformation in itself is a discipline. Payments in and of itself is a domain of subject matter expertise, but it is the people and your ability to support the people on a journey that 9 times out of 10 is what makes or breaks any initiative. So, the first myth that I have to put on the table for you today is the comfort cocoon. And what we're talking about here are those different levels of acceptance of change and just the nature of humanity to cling to the comfort cocoon because it feels predictable, it feels safe. We might not really like it, but it's what you know. And ultimately, stepping outside of it means facing into some of the unknowns, and it forces you into to a space where you need to commit to learning new things. But ultimately, the comfort cocoon is a myth because it's just an illusion of safety. There is ultimately no safety. And the world around you, it's not stopping, it will keep moving, especially in an area like financial services, especially in an area within financial services like payments. And staying where you are is it's an option, but it doesn't actually maintain the comfort. And that's the myth. It will eventually leave you feeling exposed, unprepared, and will hinder you from reaching your true potential. So I think one of the things that I was reflecting on, for example, a key element of my role is how looking at how we team up with fintechs and other organizations from a partnership perspective to see how they can integrate with existing organizations, and equally how we as incumbent organizations can support the development of the value add propositions that they have and learn some of the approaches that they take to their work. And this can be viewed in a very binary way as a cultural clash between old and new, between innovation and risk, which is never something that I've bought into. I think it really does tie back to that comfort cocoon. And ultimately, if you are not bound by it, if you are not overly attached to it, then actually whether or not you have been around for 200 years or 2 years, your eyes will be as excited at the opportunity to step into a new area, to pick up new learnings, as the next organization. But it's really important to recognize that at both an individual level and an institutional level, that change curve and that risk appetite can vary massively. And this is where it can become challenging to lead change, because some people will want to cling on to those known ways of working, those known ways of doing things, and others can be racing ahead to embrace the new. And you have people sat all the way across that change curve, and you somehow have to pull them together. And so the mayhem that this can cause in organizations, is that innovation can stagnate if you have too much of your population that is in the comfort cocoon. How do you meet a customer base that wants things faster, slicker, and you're not able to match that pace, because you're still wrapped up in the warm blanket of everything you know? The slowing down of progress can hinder communication and collaboration, and morale can dip, which can ultimately stall your journey further. Because as much as it can feel safe, when people start to recognize that it's not safe, it's also quite scary, because then the question is, what can we do about it? Are we too late? And you can have pockets of your organization that have grown so far apart, you don't have the connectivity and the unity to actually drive forward with one central purpose, which can impact the team dynamics. I think for me, the magic comes in the consistency of leadership. That is something that I think is really important to bring to the table any day of the week. But when you're dealing with change scenarios, whether it is organizational design changes, whether it is bringing in new products and services, actually being able to consistently support colleagues through the journey to set out that stall on where we're trying to get to bring forward the data and the reason that allows the unpacking of the risk and makes it into something that people can digest and can get on board with, is all hugely, hugely important. And clear communication throughout, making sure that people understand the why of the change and that you're not shying away from the concerns. There can be instances in OD changes where there are negative implications for individuals. I spent time at NatWest RBS closing down the global transaction services business across tens of countries that had huge impacts. But there was some positivity to be gained in making sure that there was a clear understanding of colleagues that winning did mean the end of your contract with the bank, and that was a good thing. And putting in place the right level of support for colleagues around their next steps, making sure you had adult to adult conversations around the likelihood of your tenure potentially being needed to be extended based on how we were progressing to plan, such that you could keep people on the journey and keep the delivery going. And I will say that ended up being a piece of activity that had colleague engagement scores that may have surpassed most BAU areas of financial services, because we clearly communicated, we consistently communicated, and we didn't shy away from the fact that there were tough conversations to be had. I think empathy and support is also the sort of underlining piece of all of this, through the vision that you set out, through how you approach the communications. Because, as I said before, the experience, the frame of reference that people come into these things to, it varies widely. So actually being able to tap into the fact that you understand and you see the anxieties that the change may surface, and you can provide resources and a safe space to have those conversations and find ways to embrace each individual's journey while still making sure that you're leading a collective pace. So I think empathy and support is absolutely critical.
And it's such a blindingly obvious when you say it out loud. Communicate, talk to people, allay their fears. Um, and yet it's not done in so many change and transformation programs and big programs I've seen where the human element is just steamrolled over. I have a quick question for you before we move on to the next one is, do you think that this the comfort cocoon is something that there's a particular age demographic that is more it's more prevalent within, or do you find that it doesn't matter what age you are, there are certain personality types that will cling to the comfort cocoon? What's it been in your experience?
So I definitely I am of the age is just a number party. Increasingly, as time goes on, you have to, or you're voting against yourself, right? But speaking completely impartially, I do think there are multiple layers to this. You know, I studied sort of cross-cultural dynamics when I was at university, and just understanding the different layers that come through an individual from what they get in their family environment, their core values that they build up, how that layers on over time, how things like a country's cultural context may layer into things, an individual's personality, the organization's cultural context within which they operate. So it's almost so multifaceted that it's heavily reductive to point to it being X or Y. But I will say on the age point, quite a lot of the time, and this is a conversation I've been having very recently, almost the constructs that we have trigger you into assuming that there is, when actually there may not be the case. You know, we would have colleagues in organizations who are approaching retirement age that just get a letter sent out by the pension company that's almost a that's it for you, thank you. But actually they are perfectly well engaged and committed to serving the organization in the best way they can, for the duration that an interesting role is on the table. So yeah, I don't see it as a binary thing. I think there are multiple layers. It's an onion scenario, rather than anything that you can sort of dial down to a specific characteristic.
I have to say I'm completely and fully in your camp, and I'm very happy with your response there. Being a not that young person anymore myself, but somebody who absolutely thrives on change and new. And you know, you do get those of us across all age brackets. I think that we run headfirst into change, whereas again across all ages you will find people that, as you say, because of a multitude of facets, will be very reluctant to change, very hesitant, and that may be stemming from personal circumstances that you know nothing about. And I think it is so important in that communication element to take all of those factors into account. What we have to remember at the end of the day is we're dealing with people. We may have this massively important new bit of regulation or change to do within our organization, but at the end of the day, it's people that make those organizations function. So, yeah, very excellent, excellent description of the comfort cocoon, the mayhem that it causes, and clear magic shared there. Let's move on to
I will just before we move on, I will just add one point, because you raised a really important piece around those who run towards change and those who run away from it. And I think viewers, if not by the end of this, sort of, you know, they may have a view on where I sit on this. And I think I'm very much with you, Andrew. I'm running towards things that other people will be running away from. But the value in the people who are professionally skeptical, the value in the people who keep you honest and will sort of stay the course in terms of comfortably challenging where we're going and why cannot be underestimated. And you never want to end up in a groupthink scenario that, for me, whilst you have to have the right sort of weightings in the change curve to effectively catalyze, you need a movement to form. You don't want everyone in the innovator box. There's a reason why in the distribution curve, that's the 5%. And then you've got, your early adopters and so on and so on. Um, that's where you can get into the very blinkered territory of move fast and break stuff. So the value that you can help people almost bring to the conversation, even if they are not naturally the first in the queue when something gets suggested, is something that we definitely shouldn't walk past as leaders.
100%. We don't want an echo chamber. That is 100%. I love being challenged on things because it makes me think broader. And I love it when I believe that I've reached a point where I've been able to evaluate things from all perspectives. If people should never just accept what's being told to them, or what I say or what any of us say, and that challenge is an absolutely critical part of change. A challenge or resistance, no matter where it comes from, we do need to think before we do. 100%. So let's move on to number 2. What's your next
Yeah.
one? I'm excited to hear here.
Oh, so the second one is currently increasingly dear to my heart, is the fragmented labyrinth, which talks to the disjointed world of payments. And I think in the UK especially, but I think it's the same globally, there is so much going on in the world of payments right now. It's hard that a day goes by and some new initiative, some new business model, something has surfaced, which can make it tricky to navigate. And interestingly, if you think back to the mythology, the monster in the myth is actually the beast that's in the labyrinth. It's in there to almost protect and safeguard. But here, the monster is the labyrinth itself, the unnavigable, impenetrable, maybe doesn't even take you anywhere nature of the world of payments right now. And we have in the UK a payments ecosystem where so much has been done, so much has been achieved, but we do still have stranded costs associated with legacy tech, clunky interfaces, disconnected initiatives, and numerous initiatives, I will say, that ultimately create confusion. And this initially manifests within firms like ourselves, but it impacts what can be delivered out to businesses and consumers. And this in an environment that is ever evolving, where we're seeing technology transform the landscape, and the need to keep up pace with digital transformation is a genuine struggle. And so the mayhem here is, as I described it to various industry colleagues a year or so ago, were this a movie, the working title would be Stop the Madness. That is the mayhem. And the reason why I say this is because in recent years, the UK market has been subject to increasing mandatory changes, saturated with initiatives that basically leaves the balance in accommodating these versus the room for emergent innovation a really tricky challenge to navigate. And because it's not resolved at an industry level, it's then resolved a layer down at the level of the institutional investment cycles. And you can guess what loses in this conversation. Your regulatory activity will always be done. It has to be done. It's important that it's done. But yeah, we've lacked a coherent plan to prioritize these activities to ensure that they take us to the future that we all want, that actually services the UK from the best possible perspective. And so part of the Stop the Madness is how do we shift that focus away from uncoordinated, large scale initiatives, top down regulation to a new way. And this is where the magic comes in, which is the National Payments Vision and Strategy, a piece of work that has been committed to by His Majesty's Treasury, which offers us up a unique opportunity to actually set out that North Star for the UK payments industry. And having that vision, having that North Star will help us strike the balance around these competing demands that I've spoken to, will help the UK market maintain its competitive edge and keep us at the forefront of progress. And so much of this goes into the purpose piece that I talked about when I was talking about my time at the FCA. The same thing applies at industry level. Having that unified direction is incredibly, incredibly powerful to take us forward through something that ultimately is a change and a transformation for the industry that can't be achieved in the near term, in the 1, 2, 3 years. It is a longer run thing. And there's so much expertise within the industry that I think can be leveraged in a more effective way, and in a more pioneering way to support that journey, and to support that industry growth. So it's something that I'm massively enthusiastic about, and believe it will get us away from this monster of the labyrinth.
So the labyrinth for me is not only confusing and adds complexity to those of us working in financial services, but it's just as confusing for the consumers, the general public that is out there, that have to deal with, new things popping up all the time, and at the end of the day, nobody really wakes up in the morning and goes, today I want to pay for something. The general consumer doesn't give a single iota about the way to pay. They don't focus on it like we do. They just want their stuff. They want their cup of
They want to
coffee.
do a thing. They
They want
want
to
to do
take
a
their
thing.
train ride. They want to do something like that. And we've got all this unnecessary, we label it as innovation. Oh, we've got all these new innovations. And yeah, I'd read somebody's LinkedIn profile, and the first line in it says, today I want to pay for something, said nobody ever. And I thought, yes.
Precisely. Precisely.
So fragmented labyrinth absolutely resonates, and as you say, it's the labyrinth itself, not the monster. We become the monsters in that labyrinth, and
We effectively do, and that's everyone in industry, the regulatory family. This is something that is a collective problem to solve for. We have created the beast, and we actually need to kill the beast and make sure that the end of the labyrinth takes us to the good place.
well, at least this is the light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully, that you've just shared with us. So let's get on to your last one.
Yes, so this one is something that I find I'm increasingly talking about it, having felt that I'd stopped talking about it a little while back, which really just shows how on top of these things you have to stay, and how easy it is for us to think that we've done a thing and tick the box and move on. And my final one is the meritocracy mirage, the notion that working hard enough is enough for underrepresented groups. And I think for me, the way this sneaks in, especially into that sort of fintech intersection between financial services and innovation, is all of the talk around hustle culture. It really, really bothers me. There's a general sentiment that I think most organisations would easily stand by, that we talk about well-being and work-life balance, and does hustle culture clash with that? But for me, there's something more fundamental there, that the myth in this one is that it suggests that success comes solely through hard work, ignoring the systemic challenges faced by underrepresented groups. And it implies that those daily frictions that these groups can experience, from things that I personally consider macroaggressions, but we talk to them as microaggressions, unconscious bias, navigating unfamiliar spaces, being the one, the few, can simply be done away with enough effort, that if you just applied yourself harder. And I've spoken quite recently on this, that I find it A, unrealistic, but B, quite insulting. And the mayhem this causes, is varied. I think it can leave people feeling like imposters. I think there is a risk that underrepresented groups can internalize this myth and question their abilities despite their hard work. I have spoken widely on the fact that, having been someone who spent most of their 20s going around saying, yes, I suffer from imposter syndrome, I now consider it a form of victim blaming, because you have the level of natural anxiety and uncertainty around growth, which I think is normal human instinct. And then you have operating in spaces where you don't necessarily feel fully included or fully safe to bring yourself. And that's where this tips over into what we then turn around and pose at the individual as imposter syndrome, something you are suffering from because you are the problem. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces of mayhem, that this unleashes. But I think it can leave people feeling undervalued and overlooked, that focus on individual effort just ignores the need for systemic changes to address bias and to create a level playing field. And so again, people will be internalizing, why not me? I thought I was trying hard. I thought I did XYZ. I ticked everything off on the list, and still. And I think the final thing from a mayhem perspective, that it can cause is increased pressure and stress. There are so many, really, I think, saddening stories from different communities, the US, the UK, anywhere you have these sort of racial disparities, of parents having to have that conversation with their children where they say, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And that constant pressure to prove yourself can lead to burnout. It can lead to decreased well-being. And for a long time, I think we kind of casually walked past that. So I do like to call it out. I think the magic begins by acknowledging the meritocracy mirage, that it is a lie, and challenging the notion of hustle culture, and focusing on real solutions. And I think this is twofold for me: it's individual care and it's organizational care. So I think the individual magic is that focus on self care, making sure you're prioritizing your well being. You are setting your stall out in terms of the behaviors that you will accept, either individually, one on one, or from a system, an organization, whatever. Where will your red lines be? What will you not take? What will not be healthy for you? I think part of the individual magic is building strong networks. You've heard leader Gila, myself, and others talking about finding your tribe. We talk about it so emphatically because you literally feel it once you have it. You know the difference that it makes. So how can you find and connect with those people who will elevate you, and who will keep your head up when it's a challenging day? And the final piece of individual magic, which really should not go overlooked, is celebrating your achievements, acknowledging the accomplishments that you've made, big or small, in what you're doing, but also how you're doing it. The little things that you have baked into how you operate, to support and to combat those feelings of stress, pressure, insecurity, to make sure you're staying whole and you're staying rounded. And then the organizational element of the magic, I think, is threefold. I think we need to challenge the bias. I think we need to actively identify and dismantle those where we see them. I think we need to create inclusive cultures, and the open communication. Again, that communication point comes through, that celebration of diversity. We talked about people in different spaces on the change curve and the value they can bring. That's a different way of thinking. This might be diversity of person, but the same thing applies. Everyone has value to bring to the conversation, and making sure you're providing those opportunity for those underrepresented voices to be heard. But the most fundamental thing of all, and the thing that we can't walk past, is doing the hard work. There's so much talk of low hanging fruit whenever you're approaching a big problem, but sometimes it's just the top of the tree, and you need to find a way to get to the top of the tree. And in this instance, it's solving the structural issues. I think it's all well and good that institutions, until we have cracked this, offer mentorship programs, sponsorship initiatives, training that's specifically designed to address the needs of underrepresented groups. But until you're redesigning the organization's soup to nuts to make sure all of those colleague journeys and processes mean the answer to the question, who gets ahead around here, is anyone who is capable and committed, you have not done the work. And that is always my plea to sort of HR and D&I leaders, is it's the structural piece that solves this. So I think by doing these things, both from an individual perspective and from an organizational perspective, we can create that work environment where everyone, regardless of background, regardless of race, regardless of experience, can succeed, can thrive, and ultimately deliver value into the organization that they're part of. That's what everybody turns up at work to do.
And so there's so much to unpack there in that last monster myth that you've got. And as the father of two daughters and brother to six sisters, I can definitely speak to the gender discrimination and bias aspect. And there's so many more when you're talking about underrepresented groups. But I believe that we've instilled that sense of self-worth in our daughters. However, it's not enough because they face the systemic bias. So one of your pieces of magic was getting the individual to understand that, yes, they are good, not just good enough, but they're excelling. And my eldest daughter has always, she's said, she's always had to work 10 times as hard as any male in the room, which is hard for me to hear, but I know it's very real. It's her lived experience. So I can't challenge that. That is 100% what she's had to go through. And yet, even showing and excelling and being the best that she is, better than anybody in the room, she still faces that systemic bias in a lot of organizations, or did until she just left and started her own company. She's now an entrepreneur and she doesn't have to deal with that. But that's not an option to a large number of people. Have you seen systemic change done successfully within financial services yet? I know that you are a massive champion of this in your own organization, and you've made huge steps forward. But is the systemic change happening? Is it, because when I speak to other colleagues from underrepresented groups around the world, they all turn around to me and they say, Andrew, nothing's changed in 20 years. The
Mm.
needle has hardly even moved on the dial, which for me, nearing the time where I hope I'm going to be leaving the world of employment altogether for a while, hopefully, it makes me depressed that in my working life, nothing has changed for those underrepresented groups. Not substantially enough for them to say, well, the needle's moved. Have you seen it done successfully yet?
So I think I don't think anyone is there, but I know organizations are on the journey. And I think one of the pieces that came out, how would we be, sort of 2-3 years ago, the Bank of England did what they call a court review. It's literally the most substantive thing, the biggest light that they can shine on an issue. And they looked at this question from an ethnicity perspective and pulled all of the data that showed exactly what you would anticipate to see. But the level of robustness in the analysis and the fact that it then forced a recognition that the challenge they had to face, it was unequivocal, I think was hugely powerful in what will have driven activities out from that sort of thereafter. I know institutionally from a Lloyds banking group perspective, a lot of work is going into the consideration and the redesign of colleague journeys. And again, inclusion and diversity is something that is at the forefront of what we're trying to achieve from an outcomes perspective and effectively how we're looking to mark our homework. So I think different organizations are on different places in the journey. But it's like any societal problem, be it individual or at a systemic level. The first part of it is recognizing you've got an issue. And the reason why I think things are as you've talked to, the needle not having moved, it's been decades. We've been talking about gender for 30 odd years now. Why haven't we solved it just yet? It's largely down to the maturity of HR and D&I as domains maturing alongside this issue. We've effectively been iterating our way to solutions. And I think the first wave of D&I just looked at, we don't have the people. How do we make sure that we have the people that fulfill the spectrum of experiences, ethnicities, you name it, and open the door to them? And guess what? They got them in the door, but then they didn't stay. I think the second wave of D&I is exactly what I talked to a moment ago around, okay, we can't just get them in the door, we need to help them. And so all of the programs, all of the initiatives, the era of the D&I initiatives sprung up. And we had all of these different programs and activities happening. But guess what? The people left because these were sideline initiatives that were never baked into the fabric and the construct of the organization. So it's only now we've gotten into third wave D&I where it is basically fronting into the fact that this is systemic, and unless you change the system, you cannot win the game. That in a way, it's the first time we have had the opportunity to fully solve the issue. So whilst it pains me and it kills me that you're exactly right in terms of what you say, the needle hasn't moved, and in some cases the needle has moved backwards. The risk of female executives leaving organizations and the sector as a whole in the coming 5 years has polled incredibly highly across the Netherlands, across Belgium, across the UK. It's not just a single jurisdiction issue. People are saying, I can do this now, and I know I can do this now, but at what cost? Because the system hasn't changed. We are running against the clock here. But actually, that is why I think we haven't to date seen this solved for. But now we know what is required. If in another 30 years' time we haven't done the thing, we really don't have an excuse.
I hate to end on a point like that. That feels like gloom, but it is reality. But we are severely over time, and I thank you so much for giving me us and the audience such phenomenal insights and things to think about. Your last, the meritocracy mirage, has made me think about Michael Jackson, Man in the Mirror, the lyrics to that, that go, starting with the man in the mirror, asking him to change his ways, and no message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make that change. And I would call on anybody who has, they may not want to admit it, but they've been sitting in a position of privilege. I know that as an old white male, I have had unprecedented privilege when compared to my peers in the industry that on from the same kind of background as me, and that's made me, admittedly not early enough, but it has made me a massive champion of change. And my particular one is gender diversity, that I push hard for because of the woman in my life, but all forms of underrepresentation that need to be addressed at a systemic level. Otherwise, we will hemorrhage the best talent because they will just give up. They really will. It really does hurt people right to their core when this isn't solved for. So my plea would be to anybody who has come from a position of privilege and understand that privilege comes in multiple different ways, is to lend out a helping hand and figure out how the hell you can be part of the change and not part of the problem, because it has to change. This is depressing to hear year on year, decade by decade, that we still can't solve for this in this day and age. Sam, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.